I'm here to talk to you about the underground wrestling show that played on MTV. What a sentence that was. But yes, it's real. I'm talking, of course, about Wrestling Society X. A forgotten wrestling show that lasted all of one season, but had a roster consisting of a pretty decent amount of names of the past and future. Guys like Seth Rollins, Jimmy Jacobs, Scorpio Sky, Teddy Hart, Colt Cabana, X-Pac, Justin Credible, New Jack, Vampiro, Matt Sydal, Judas Messias, Joey Ryan, Vic Grimes, the one-day Stone Cold Steve Austin, Luke Hawx, M-Dog, and that guy who stabbed John Cena that one time. Little known fact, the X in Wrestling Society X stands for Extreme Insanity. In a very short time, this company runs through every wrestling trope it can think to go through. Thumbtacks, ladders, people putting each other through tables, convoluted match types that would make it hard to explain being a wrestling fan to someone who isn't already one. I mean, seriously, the first episode ends with a Royal Rumble ladder match that ends when two people grab a contract for the world title. That is a thing that happens. Vinny Roo, eat your heart out. Not much longer after do they have a TLC match, which, in case you were unaware of, stands for a Tables, Ladders, and Cervezas match. Yes, you did hear me correctly. The last unaired episode even includes an exploding cage match and a piranha death match. WSX was just... it was just a vibe, man. Where else are you going to see someone electrocute a guy after pouring water all over him? Or a cartel jumping that ends with somebody's head in cement? And I hope you like explosions, because there's a ton of that going on here. Sometimes they're real, other times they're made in editing, and sometimes it's both. They're there when it makes sense to have them, and they're especially there when it doesn't make sense to have them. This gimmick was so overused that it's pretty much what the Fed is most remembered for. But to its credit, at least it had an identifiable trait. Honestly, WSX kind of feels like what someone who has never watched wrestling thinks that wrestling is. It is the most basic and bizarre interpretation of sports entertainment. It's goofy, gimmicky shit. Not that I'm saying that's necessarily a bad thing. In terms of presentation, there's something charming to me about the WSX setup. It has its own bizarre lore and look, taking place in a bunker with a beat-up wrestling ring that's supposed to be kept on the DL. That is so perfectly corny and so perfectly carny. I applaud MTV for even wanting to put together something that looks like a paperclip production with a shoestring budget. But it works. It kind of makes each of these shows feel like an underground event. It makes for a different viewing experience that you weren't going to get on any other televised wrestling program. It's different and distinct, sometimes to a fault. I mean, honestly, where else are you going to find wrestlers entering down a nearly broken ladder? It's a good aesthetic atmosphere that gives its presentation its own personality. And speaking of personality, on commentary you have the very underrated and sometimes hated Chris Claus. Chris Claus has this really interesting way of commentating, where despite being a play-by-play guy, he hypes up the current situation as if he was a color commentator. His loud, unmistakable voice is great. When he's not screaming, the man sounds like a young Don West. And then when he is yelling, he sounds like a human car alarm. I have no better way of explaining that to you. That's what this man sounds like.
Right, the bomb! They blew up the...
I also really enjoy that he put over the former XPW talent on the roster a lot on commentary, making it feel like there is some branch of continuity here, even if it isn't greatly explained. Less memorable is his commentating partner, Brett Ernst. He's not bad by any means, but he is a bit bland, and doesn't contribute as much as his partner does. But then again, he doesn't really get the chance to, because Chris Claus is just, well, being Chris Claus. They're joined weekly by a new musical guest who also calls the matches with them. This is something that could surprisingly be fun, like when Zach Wilde came on.
Now, Zach, rumor has it you're a big breakdancing fan. Is that false?
No, you know what? We can get in the ring right now. We can solve that, okay? Right now, this fight is the same fight I saw with Father Morello when I was at the St. Aloysius Church when I was 13 years old. It's the same type of fight.
Somebody get this man a cocktail. I mean, get him a drink.
But could also sometimes be a complete disaster, like the time when Clips came on. That man was to WSX what Art Donovan was to WWE.
1, 2, and then no! I thought that was it right there.
That was a slow count. He took too long with his finishing move.
Great observation.
Kind of like the Blues Brothers and Tenacious D.
Well, how much does this guy weigh?
Ring announcer Fabian Kalin really deserves a lot of praise. The guy had a lot of passion for what he was doing and put his heart and soul into every introduction and announcement. He was less a ring announcer and more of a host. It's not just what he sounded like when he announced competitors, it's what he looked like announcing competitors. Between twirling around like Wonder Woman to introduce Human Tornado, or the subtle crotch chops he'd hit when calling for X-Pac, the guy just had unlimited charisma. I've never seen a more enthusiastic announcer. It does teeter on the cusp of being annoying, but it's mostly welcome. He also had this whole thing where he'd become more and more Clockwork Orange over time. There's apparently a reason for this, but I don't know, maybe we'll just get into that some other time. Point is, everything here was different. Even the camera angles and shots used feel different than what was available at the time. And even different from the way a lot of shows are filmed now. Instead of in-ring or backstage segments, WSX furthered storylines solely through pre-taped vignettes and promos. While it is fairly basic, it is enough to convey a short story. And a short story it was, in many different ways. As ultimately, the company only lasted 10 episodes, 9 of which aired, before being cancelled. And each episode was only a half hour long. They really had a full wrestling show in half the time it would take you to finish a Game of Thrones episode. The company's fingerprint didn't end at just appearances. The way it was operated was also appropriately unorthodox, with all matches being held under Falls Count Anywhere rules. This also applied to tags as well, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense and looks really dumb and sloppy on camera. But you know, sometimes you gotta try it before you know not to do it. I can't say that I'm a fan of every addition to the product. The use of plants and extras is beyond blatant. It's a little too on the nose when they always use close-ups of the audience over the top reactions, feigning shock, horror, and applause. It's a pretty obvious and pretty cheesy tactic. Making matters even worse is clearly fake piped-in audience noise. Once you notice it, you will never unnotice it. I mean, audibly the fans are going wild, but visually, they're staying fairly mild. And there's also not that many of them to create this big background noise. Who would they think they were kidding? There are also a lot of special effects used that I personally feel do a disservice to the actual wrestling. Like, you don't need to put an earthquake effect over an explosion. And you most certainly don't have to add a really bad glimmer effect over the diamond-studded ladder. Actually, you don't even need a diamond-studded ladder, to tell you the truth. That was just unnecessary. Not needed. And is it really worth doing a fireball if you have to censor over it to the point that no one can tell what actually happened? Don't even get me started with the heartless Quiznos plugs. They're hilariously awful. Usually you have second-long replays brought to you by this sandwich shop, which is a strange choice as it is, given that the show was already struggling with its runtime, but again, we'll get into that. But there's also one episode where chaos has erupted in the ring as the episode's drawing to a close. And then we just get a random shot back at commentary, watching our commentary team eat their sandwiches and comment on how good they are. Are you f***ing kidding me? What I'm trying to say here is that Wrestling Society X had its own identity, and it was pretty unique, especially for the time. You weren't going to get the same experience you got here anywhere else. For better or worse, it had personality. However, as each episode was only a half hour long, everything always felt rushed. Because it was. Can you imagine that? An entire wrestling show in under an hour? Vince McMahon could never. I mean, how do you fit an hour and a half's worth of entertainment into a 30-minute window of time? Serious condensing was done to each and every episode, and I think it really negatively affected the overall quality of the product. Every match feels like you're watching them on fast forward. They feel like someone's YouTube highlight reels of actual matches. The problem is even highlighted by the guest commentator on an episode. Sometimes story elements and plot points are completely glossed over. Like, I still have no answer as to whether or not X-Pac was in cahoots with Ricky Banderas, or if it was just chance that Banderas came out to attack Vampiro when X-Pac called him out. It's an unanswered question, but it's not a question that goes unasked, as commentary literally bring this up.
Could this be a setup by Pac? I mean, he's leaving!
For me as a fan personally, I prefer good storytelling amongst anything else. From promos to segments to actual in-ring work. I want to see a narrative unfold in an interesting sequence of events. And there is none of that here in WSX. But how could there be? There wasn't enough time to tell the story. There's hardly enough time to even have a standard wrestling show. There is so much that gets lost in translation. Information is presented in passing as matches are sped up in post. Episodes typically only consist of 3 matches, sometimes not even that. And because of the short runtime, episodes almost always end abruptly. There's no closer or goodbye, it just ends, it's over. Even if it doesn't feel like it has an actual ending, there's no closing point. Because of how little time each show was afforded, that meant each personality had limited time on screen. Meaning that you're not going to see the same wrestlers on each and every show. Sometimes you'll see somebody once, and then they won't show back up until 3 or 4 episodes later. Or in some cases, they just never appear again. Even the world champions don't get screen time every episode. And then other wrestlers will suddenly appear and be treated as if they were always an integral part of the show. But I don't know who this is. He's never been here before. You didn't even give me a proverbial handshake. Because of this, it's hard to determine what the actual roster looks like, and it makes the product feel very inconsistent. Who is it that we're supposed to be paying attention to? I've watched this whole season back, and it's still hard for me to tell who was supposed to be important. I think X-Pac was supposed to be a main eventer. Stifle your laughter. But he barely ever has a match. Vampiro wins the WSX title, cuts one promo, and then he never speaks again throughout the rest of his reign. That's not a plot point either, they just didn't have time to hear their champion speak. Ironically, in contrast, his archenemy, the future Judas Messias Ricky Banderas, is afforded way too much time to speak when it doesn't sound like he's fluent in the language that he's speaking. He's so hard to understand that they have to subtitle his promos. So why didn't you just have him speak in Spanish? You can still subtitle it, but he would sound more natural and authentic. Why make him go through the extra trouble if there's no gain from it? The matches are mostly fairly impressive, which should come as no shock given the talent that's involved. But they don't really have a lot of room to breathe. They just go from spot to spot to spot. Editing lends very little time for anyone to sell moves, meaning that the whole impact of said move is almost entirely lost. Regardless, there's some really good fast-paced action here, and if that's your thing, this is the place for you. The time restraints really suffocated whatever life could be in the product, and greatly decreased its quality of life. In spite of its issues, I do find the product to have its own charm. I think it was a unique, dysfunctional force of nature that tried something different. It wasn't all good, but it wasn't all bad either. If you like lighthearted wrestling and you don't take it too seriously, I think this might be the show for you. So go ahead and track it down if you've never seen it. And if you like this video and would like to see a follow-up looking at all of WSX content, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
This is wrestling. This!
I am vengeance. I am the night. And that was Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.